I had overcome some extraordinary events to arrive where I am today. Throughout my existence, I have narrowly escaped death, a life of crime and poverty, and I have been presented with family issues, community issues, and societal issues. My mother is plump, has dark bleached skin with an inviting smile. Monica Elliott. Shep was living in the notorious Waterhouse in the heart of Kingston at the time of my birth. My father, Earl Lancelot Webb, I imagine, was living in Kingston on Roseau Road. From as early as I can recall, my family life has been far from ideal. I have no recollection of my mother and father ever being under one roof. My father is of medium height, orchard-toned, clean-shaved head, but his receding hairline is palpable. He resembles me a lot with his big nose, though I know nothing much about my father. My mother gave birth to me on the 30th of November, 1989, when she was only 15 years old, 10 days away from her 16th birthday. She was poor, uneducated and unfit to raise a child, mentally and physically. She got little or no assistance from my father. If she did, I had no knowledge of it. A teenage delinquent mother without any income saw no other choice but to shift her parental responsibility to her mother. I lived with my mother, grandmother, aunties and cousins for most of my early life. I can remember my mother being absent most of the time because of some new lover she found. I was introduced by my mother to numerous stepfathers, usually some low-life scum gangsters. I was exposed to violence, sex, drugs, and alcoholism from a tender age. This exposure led to irregular patterns in my behavior, yet expected. My early interest in sex in the early days led to me being isolated from my female cousins. My exposure to violence led to constant fights in my school. Also, drugs and alcohol prevented me from tapping into my full potential. The men I was given by my mother to be my role models were looked down on by society, so that there is no confusion or misunderstanding. Let me clearly say, I love and respect my mother. What is said is not to belittle her in any form. I am merely stating the events as they occurred. I remember living with my mother and my stepfather, name change, said CP now deceased. My inability to control my sexual urges forced my grandmother to send me to live with my mother and her lover. CP was tall, light brown. He had a cut across his cheekbone and a menacing grin. During the 2 years living with Mom and Paul, I witnessed my mother being abused. What my mother had to do to survive, and I saw drugs and alcohol being abused by every man, woman and child. Despite our circumstances, I had no doubt my mother loved and cared for me. I have countless recollections of her giving her only money to me. She gave me advice the best way she knew how and rose to my defense whenever I required her protection. The domestic dispute escalated. I can remember clearly the rich dark red blood flowing from mother's eyebrow as she runs for refuge in a neighbor's house. My stepfather yelling, obviously angered, with a broken glass bottle in his hand on the outside of the one-room shack, mumbling, "You and the fisherman there." My mother went for a knife and clash of words ensued. Shortly after the police came, stepfather escaped by mounting a nearby wall that would have landed him on Kid Lane. We were living on Norman Lane at the time. The very day of the incident, I was rushed to my grandmother's home. I was now living with my grandmother once again, and my mother stayed with my stepfather until he was gunned down by his friends for a missing gun. I love my grandmother. She has a beautiful dark shade. She is short with mixed African hair. Living with my grandmother was a bittersweet experience. I was favored by my grandmother, maybe because I had no real parents or because I gave her a second chance to raise a son, or both. This inspired envy in my aunt and my step-grandfather. In my rare years, my aunt made my life a living hell. I remember vividly being beaten by my aunt to the point where I suffer a wound to the head caused by a belt buckle because I prepared an egg my grandfather, my father's father, gave me. I can remember being locked outside without any food or any bathroom facility from Monday to Friday during the summers whilst she went to work. She ensured her daughter was left secured inside. I often have to remind myself that this is a selective memory because on many occasions my aunt was like a mother to me. My aunt always took care of all my education matters, and whenever I have no one else to run to, I could always turn to my aunt. My grandmother accepted me in her life a second time around, but this time around, she was to get married to her lover known to me for approximately 5 years. It was my first time attending a wedding. It was a home wedding. My grandmother looked beautiful on her wedding day, dressed in a beautiful white gown. In my estimation, it was an awesome get-together almost moments after the vows were read and the I do's were said. I saw who my grandmother really had married. A selfish, childish and narrow-minded man. From that day on, it was almost as I was unable to do anything right in his eyes. He complained about how I walked, talked, think, and breathe. He complained until it reached a point where my grandmother had to choose between her husband and her grandson. I have now forgiven him, but I have not forgotten how he divided my family in order to conquer my grandmother. My grandmother, my step-grandfather and I moved to Vineyard Town a few years after. On my very first day coming from school, I was robbed. I was held up by knife point by 3 members of the D&G dance group back then. They stole my cellular phone at the time. My cellular phone was in a horrible condition. The phone screen fell off in the robbers' hands, but they took the cell phone anyways and returned my SIM card. This angered me. As a result, I started to associate myself with persons from the area, which ultimately led to me abandoning my childhood ambitions. I attended Calabar High School, a place that a kid with my family background considered at the time to be hell packaged as heaven. In high school, I was undermining authority, getting into fistfights, gang feud, gambling, DJing, breakdancing, barbering and skipping classes. I did everything to get the attention I was not getting at home. I bleached my skin, dyed my hair, wore white shoes and wore tight pants, fashionable in my days, but against the school rules. Finally, I got that attention I didn't get at home. Also, I thought it didn't take a long time to realize that all I had was a lot of silent enemies and friends that envied me. I recall one day after school on my way to training, I was attacked cunningly by a downtown Kingston Don's son, who had a garlic knife in a handkerchief and used it to wound me on my right arm. It took a couple of minutes after being wounded before I realized I was wounded. All I remember feeling was the feeling of my blood crawling on my skin. I am still baffled up to today as to why he wanted me dead. I recalled being mocked by jealous schoolmates because of my good fortune with the opposite sex. I remember my best friend at the time, Rothany Rochester, dedicated his inter-school life to ruin my character. I believed it had something to do with his girlfriend and I making out. But I was a friend enough to him and even suggested that we exchange girlfriends, which we did. I guess he never forgave me. I remember failing 6 CXCs while scoring a grade 3 in Principles of Business and Principles of Accounts. On the day that I got the results marked the day that I started smoking. I bought 2 cigarettes and started to reflect on how I taught myself to read and write at the primary school level, and was fortunate enough to be the only one from my class at Red Hills Primary and Junior High School to pass for Calabar High. I blamed everyone. My parents, my step-grandfather, my friends, my teachers, everyone. But then myself. I knew I was brilliant. I am not saying I was an innocent bystander in all this, or am I attempting to deflect blame. I take full responsibility for all the events and circumstances I found myself in. Things escalated between my step-grandfather and me, and my aunt surprisingly came to my refuge. She invited me to live with her and her family in Portmore. I accepted, not that I had much choice. My aunt's house, much smaller than the Kingston houses that I used to I slept on the couch. I still remember how uncomfortable it was, but it was an upgrade from sleeping bags. While in Portmore, I sought out my high school friends and dance group member, Hector Lewis, Chad Goulbourne, Romar Choi, Jomo Powell, and Joni Teo Scarlett. I intended to pursue a dancing career, which I did for a short period. Jomo and I had less parental restrictions, so we were able to go to all the parties. Passa Passa, Dutty Friday, Weddy Weddy Wednesday, Quad, Asylum, etc. We also brought along Jerry, R.I.P., Chipaz, and sometimes Don Diago. We went to parties all over the island. I met Lottelie, my daughter's mother. During this period of my life, I made a connection with Manasi, Color, Kai Kai Ching, Siddiqui, Turkle, Chicken and Beer, and many more. After a few years, I shifted my focus to music, my love, my first love. I had little success in DJing, apart from my appearance on Magnum Kings and Queens, even though my songs were being copied and used by renowned artists in Jamaica like Danny and Popkin. With my grandmother's and my aunt's influence, my focus shifted back to school. I was given the opportunity to pursue some more CXCs. I got mathematics and office administration. I then enrolled in an HT Hard program, which eventually led to me landing a job in an insurance company. Whilst working for the company, I united with a high school friend, Valentin Brown, a tall, fair-skinned and well-read fellow. By this time I already had a daughter. It was during this reunion with Valentin, I was encouraged to get in the habit of reading, which led us having discussions, which inspired me to write poetry, and through poetry I found myself. And because I found myself, it changed my way of thinking. And with that change in thought, I realized that there are powers working to oppress and suppress a person of my color, class, and persuasion. I realized my family, community, and myself were not the only or main culprits responsible for the oppression, suppression, and brainwashing I had the experience. I realized that the main perpetrators are the few that manipulate the many.